Buzu.
MSA.
Thank you for joining us. And we have to say, just so you're all on the same page as us, this is totally unscripted. We don't even really have questions. We started talking in the back in the green room, and it was really hilarious, actually. We were supposed to have questions because we were all supposed to coordinate our calendars at one point and try and figure that out. But sadly, all of us were kind of everywhere, and it didn't really happen until you reached out on Facebook one late night, and because, as you know, we all use Facebook Messenger to keep in contact with each other. And you're like, what are we going to say? And I was like, well, I don't know. This is going to be good. But you mentioned this should be a discussion about what it's like to be sitting around the kitchen table, having some tea, having some bannock, and talking about what our thoughts are. And, I wanted, since I'm sort of a person who always makes questions up for a living, that's what I do, I thought that maybe I would start by asking a question. And I wanted to actually start by asking a question to you, Nahanni. I wanted to, and then I'm going to ask you the same question. I wanted to ask you a question of, is there room for us in contemporary politics? And I know that's a hard question, considering who I'm sitting here on the stage with, both of you. But is there?
Anine, everyone. So I am Nahanni Fontaine. I'm the NDP MLA for St. John's. That was previously noted by Ryan, which I say miigwech. I just say miigwech to Broadbent for inviting us on the stage today, which I think is proper to have 3 Indigenous women on the stage to talk about reconciliation. In answering the question in respect of whether or not there's room for Indigenous peoples within the political sphere, let me just share this, and it is wholly my perspective. In the Manitoba legislature, in the last 124 years, there has been somewhere like 834 men elected and 60 women. Predominantly everybody, that space was made by and for white men. So of the 834 men that have been elected, predominantly all of them have been white. Of the 60 women who have been elected, only 5 are not white. And I know that sometimes my language makes people uncomfortable when I start saying, when I talk about white people, but I think that it's important for us to recognize that. And so of the 5 for the 5 women who are not white, the first non-white woman to ever be elected is my colleague, Flora Marcelino, who is a Filipino. The other 4 are Indigenous. There's myself, my sister Bernadette Smith, who is an NDP MLA. The first ever First Nation woman elected to the Manitoba legislature is my colleague, Amanda Lathleen, who is the MLA for the PAW. And then we have a Liberal sister, who is Judy Clausen from Kiiwetinoong. Is there space? I would argue that it's taken us this long, particularly as Indigenous women, to claim that space. The first ever Indigenous woman was only elected in 2015, and since then we have 4 now in total. I don't know if it's about, this narrative like, well, we have to make space. Actually, it's about reclaiming that space and making that space ours. Which I will just share as well very, very quickly, that it's not easy. I can tell, I'm very open and honest about everything, but the first 6 weeks that I was elected, I was actually in a shock, because you walk in that space, you sit in that chamber where very, very few people ever get the opportunity to do that. And I can tell you unequivocally, it is a toxic male space. And it is difficult to sit there and to fight for your space and fight for your people. But now is the time to do it, if there was ever a time.
Miigwech. Jessica?
So I'm here as a public servant. So any political affiliation I may have is not represented by my presence here today. And yet I am a political body simply by being an Indigenous woman. What I say, I agree very much with reclaiming the space. I come from Smoigit people. I come from noble, high-ranking people with a long tradition, not just of singing and dancing, but of governance, of economy, of healthcare, of science. And we have all of the traditions that make for a great community. And to bring that teaching is a teaching of public service, which is what I think elected and public servants are. We are public servants. I strongly believe that these are our spaces, and somewhere along the line, we were made to feel unwelcome in our own decisions. I am often the first or the only Indigenous person, let alone queer Indigenous woman in a space. I work in a resource ministry, so my colleagues are largely from the resource sector, and they do not look like me. So when I walk into a space, I physically represent the change that I am actually ushering in. And it's not because I'm, don't clap for that. It's uncomfortable. I appreciate the honor, but it is unbearably uncomfortable so much of my time. And yet, I should be entitled to this space. The fact that I have discomfort is not because I don't belong there. It's because I shouldn't be alone there, because my interests are there. So regardless of how much space there is, it is ours. If it's not on this land, whose land is it on? If it's not our governance, whose governance is it? So I firmly believe that we are entitled to all of this space, that we are entitled to our own decisions, that we can lead not only our nations, but the nation.
Miigwech. You know, you are both such powerful women. You have both had, before you got into bureaucracy and politics, you did so much for so many. And it's tiring work, right? It's such hard work sticking up and defending our women, all the work you both have done. And I wanted to ask you both, and this is part of the kitchen table part, how do you keep going? How, like sometimes, aren't you tired? And how do you do it? How do you just keep going?
I think that is a really important discussion to have among what I hope are allies. Because I would suggest that probably some of my Black brothers and sisters in the room will understand what we're talking about when we say we're exhausted. We're exhausted of educating and re-educating. I'm exhausted that every time, like my sister, every time you're the only Indigenous person or the only Indigenous woman in a room, and you have to fight for what little dignity will be given to you, or what little humanity will be given to you. I'm exhausted of trying to make people understand and know and experience the goodness of our people, the genuineness of our people, the resilience of our people, the happiness of our people, the love and the courage of our people. I'm exhausted. I've been doing this work for close to 22 years now, and on the front lines, in the protests, at funerals, you name it, I've been there. And I have always said that it is my sacred responsibility to do so because I have the strength and the privilege and the ability to do so. But it is important for people to stand up so that I don't have to do it anymore, so that my sister doesn't have to do it anymore, so that my sister over here doesn't have to do it anymore. You know, when we talk about reconciliation and it was ended with, what are you going to do? stand up, educate yourself. When you see racism, when you see a lack of representation, stand up. It is your responsibility. That is what an ally does. And if you want to practice reconciliation, that is one way to start, is to stand up, educate yourself, and take away some of the emotional labor that we're forced to do 24/7. And I don't say that in a I'm so angry and there's another, angry Indigenous woman. It's that I'm exhausted. Just yesterday, one of our youth wrote on her Facebook, she said, I'm exhausted. She said, I'm exhausted of working in white space, trying to educate white frontline workers about the traumas that our people have been through. And like us, I'm exhausted of being negatively socially constructed because I'm forced to do so. We're exhausted as Indigenous people. So you can help by that one thing. That is a manifestation of reconciliation, is stand up for us.
Rich.
I'm tired. I'm not going to lie, but I have the privilege of being tired for a very different reason. I work in a government that put implementation of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People into every single mandate letter, who has pledged to bring the declaration. I don't use the acronym because I find it undignified, and I think that we should refer to our human rights in a dignified manner. But my job is to bring that declaration into provincial law by the end of this year. So, yeah, clap for that one. I'm tired because we were able to secure a $3 billion investment directly into the hands of Indigenous people through our sharing gaming revenue. That's $100 million a year directly controlled by Indigenous people into the hands of Indigenous people. I'm tired because we're doing housing as a province on reserve for the first time in Canadian history. So I am tired, but I'm not defeated, and that is the difference. But one of the things you talk about is that activism and that activism at funerals. And the reason that I'm tired is because I'm alone. I am alone, and I am in this position, and I have this title, and nobody understands by the acronym what it is that I do, so then I explain it. And it's so impressive, but I didn't write the declaration. I wish I had. I knew a few people that did. It was written by Indigenous people. This is Indigenous knowledge and wisdom. I'm tired because I've been passed a baton that has been carried for so long that we don't even know who picked it up in the first place. And I'm tired because I shouldn't be here. I am not the fastest. I am not the smartest. I am not the most educated. I am the one who survived from the women who protected me when I could not keep myself safe. I am not here because I am exceptional. I am here because the circumstances of my survival allowed for it, not by design, but by accident. So many of the women that I love and respect have been lost along the way. So many women from my community, we have the Highway of Tears. From my community, we have the Downtown East Side. From my community, we have immeasurable numbers of loss, so I do not have the privilege of not being tired, but I also have the privilege of being here. So the reason that I take up that space is because the thing that they left me with was hope. The thing that they left me with was allyship. The thing that they left me with was the ability to dramatically change where we are today so tomorrow is nothing like it. And I am tired because I want to fundamentally shift the direction that we have been on since contact.
Do you mind if I just follow up with that? And I want to follow up and say miigwech for that. And why I think, when I started by saying it's proper to have 3 Indigenous women, because in the context of the Canadian colonial history that we have and the continuum of said, we presently, this very minute, operate and live within a country in which Indigenous women and girls are slaughtered on the daily or are stolen on the daily. So for the three of us to be on this stage alive, to be able to come before you and talk about reconciliation or the importance of political representation or any of these things, in and of itself is bloody phenomenal. My mother, you know, my sister here talks about the Vancouver downtown east side. My mother left the reserve, I shared this, you know, last year at 13, was sexually exploited across Canada, lost her life from a heroin overdose after living 14 years on the downtown east side. And like my beautiful sister here, I know that I'm only here because of my ancestors who came before me. So the very fact that the three of us are here alive is phenomenal. And I just want to, you know, acknowledge each and every one of the Indigenous women across the country who survived today in a very spiritual, emotional, but certainly a very physical way.
Gitchin Miigwech, for acknowledging that. You know, I have to say it's the same thing. We are standing here, sitting here with our ancestors. Our ancestors got us here. They survived it all so we could be here doing what we're doing here today. And it's so true. I'm glad you brought up what we were talking about too in the back before we got on stage, which was none of us really wanted to be sitting up here doing this right now. We didn't have a burning desire to be like, you know, up there doing what we're doing. What are we doing? We don't know what we're doing, you know, but we're doing it because we looked around and it's like, well, you've got the baton. And it's true. We don't know where it came from, but somebody passed it to us and we happen to be standing in the right spot. And so there is that feeling of responsibility. You know the stories. You've been given the stories. Now you have to carry them forward, which is what I think that all of us try to do. In keeping with that, what does, and you touched on this a little bit about all the incredible work you are doing to make sure human rights are respected in BC. But what, for you, Nahanni, what does progress look like? How do you know we're getting anywhere?
I mean, that's such a multi-layered question. Let me just start with a little bit of a political backdrop in Manitoba, excuse me. In 2016, the NDP government, when we were still in government, passed the Path to Reconciliation Act, and it legislated the ability and the need to look at reconciliation in a comprehensive, robust manner, similar to BC. We lost government. We currently have a PC government under Brian Pallister. I can tell you what it doesn't look like right now. So we have a premier who, you know, I think it was last year, there was discussion in respect of night hunting, which our people would or do consider as a treaty right. And actually he was caught, filmed, or whatever, audio taped, speaking, unlike our Prime Minister just a couple of days ago, speaking to a group. And actually what he did in there was he talked about how, you know, we have, and again I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember the whole thing, but essentially he said, you know, we have a whole bunch of Indigenous men, criminals, who are night hunting. So in that one sentence, what you did as the premier of a province was you constructed all Indigenous men and boys as criminals, as if we don't already deal with that 24/7. When our young men and our young boys cannot walk down the street without being carted, or cannot walk down the street without being stopped. But here you have the premier who fundamentally situated Indigenous men and boys like that. I'm raising 2 Indigenous boys, strong, powerful, smart, handsome Indigenous boys. As an Indigenous woman, I was so offended. And remarkably so, which I thought was offensive, was that there wasn't much outrage about that. And that gives you just a brief glimpse into how Indigenous people are seen. And so, you know, I share that story with you because I think that it is particularly egregious in 2018, 2019 to have a premier who very consciously negatively socially constructs Indigenous men, Indigenous youth. But what is changing? What is the change that gives me hope, and I suspect most of us across the country, are our youth. I'm sure that you can go anywhere across the country and see Indigenous youth who are so bloody powerful and so engaged and so articulate and standing in their truth and standing in their power as Indigenous people. When I see that, I think of the work that we've done and the work that's come before us. That is the fruit of all of that work. For my sons to be so proud of who they are and to walk with such pride and strength, that is the fruit of all of that hard labor.
Very well said.
The piece about youth and what we get to do, I mean, I talked about the things that we as a province are doing, but it's dangerous to take for granted. It's dangerous to think that somehow we initiated any of those ideas. That's being responsive. So I still have to have the talk with my children about where they put their hands if they're ever pulled over in a vehicle. I still have to talk to my daughter about her safety in a way that nobody should ever have to articulate, and she knows too well because she has watched me for 20 years participate in that conversation. She knows too well why, as a second-year university student in sciences, she has no contemporaries in her school. And those things are not okay. And those things are the exception and should be the rule. There is no reason why my JA, who is 86, mostly blind, partially deaf, is still able to run an Airbnb and a catering company, be up before me and go to bed after me and run our whole family and administer justice and not be recognized for the economic powerhouse she is in our community, for the way that she has been able to raise us to be alive, to have dreams, to articulate them. My auntie was the first one in our family to go through university. As an adult with kids, we don't expect our children to be in university straight out of high school, so there weren't services there to support her when she enters into the culture shock. And we can change that. That's policy. But that's also kids in care. That's also the hope, right? That's why we do it. I have this conversation of how to keep yourself safe against ridiculous circumstances. I have to articulate and I can't articulate even to them what's happened to me. I can't articulate the absolute impossible. How could I share that? How do you share that? But no, you try to share the resilience. You try to share the strength. We're trying to put back in place that inheritance from our ancestors that is life, not death.
Such powerful words. You know, and I know we all know this so intimately, too, what you're saying. I want to say, since we are here, I'm going to turn this for a minute. And if we were sitting around the table, I would also be asking you, why should we vote in the next election? And what are we looking for? Who's the best? No, I know where I'm sitting, and who I'm talking to, but like, put all that aside. Like, if you could have your wish, what would you see? What would you want?
I'm not Jody. No, I'm kidding. I get that a lot. I'm not.
That was funny. Oh, no. No one wants to take this one. Oh, she's going to do it. Okay, good.
Well, I think that's a great question. And you know what? I really do appreciate the folks that just yelled out Jody. I think that we have seen in the last month, there is no better, no quintessential example of the strength and dignity and courage of Indigenous women than what we saw last month in Jody Wilson-Raybould. And obviously, even though we are in different parties, I have, as an Indigenous woman, I have an enormous amount of respect and love for what she did. And not only for what she did, within the confines and the bubble of what is, party politics, but what she did for all of Canadians. I think it is important to recognize what goes on in those levels. And so I have an enormous amount of respect, and we all should. Why should people vote? To me, I have been voting since I was 18. I have raised both of my boys to come to every single election with me from the time that they were babies. My oldest now is 23. He's been voting since he was 18. And why I think it is so important, even in the midst of frustration, is that people lose their lives across the world to be able to vote. It is a right, but in many places, it's an absolute privilege. People lose their lives to go cast their vote. We are so blessed to be able to stand in line and cast our vote for those that align with our values and our morals. We have an opportunity. So here's two things. Sorry, I know I'm going all over the place. We have an opportunity to do two things. One, in every election, municipal or provincial or federal, it is incumbent on political parties, but also the voters and also labor to back and support people of color, Indigenous candidates, Muslim candidates, Sikh candidates, everybody. Because if you look at our legislatures across the country, it does not reflect our provinces, and it certainly does not reflect our country. There has to be space made to ensure that our legislatures reflect the population. That only makes our legislatures better, more representative. It is incumbent on all of us to pursue those goals. I know that for myself in Manitoba, do you know that it is 2019, and I know maybe some of you guys have heard me say this, but we have never had a Black person elected to the Manitoba legislature. We've never had a Muslim person elected to the Manitoba legislature. I don't know what the stats are across the country, but that is unacceptable. It is simply unacceptable. Voters deserve better. We all deserve better. So my second point, and I'll stop, is that we have an opportunity this election to create history across Canada by electing the first person of color Prime Minister in Jagmeet Singh. And that is a responsibility that if you are on the left, if you are progressive, then to get out and make that happen.
This is where I take my public service hat off. I'm going to put it right there. It's got my business card and my title. I can't tell you who to vote for. I can tell you that what has happened in BC, the potential that we have to live up to fundamentally change what comes next as Indigenous people has been centered in the work of the entire province of 30,000 public servants. So I'm tired, but 30,000 public servants are pretty tired right now too. So it's work. And to intrinsically commit to that work, to do the big things, is something that I hope people will consider when they vote. And I hope you will push to have voting boxes on reserve. I hope you will push for the Indigenous youth vote. I hope you will make this central to your platforms, not now, but forever, because the work isn't going to stop. Somebody asked me once, well, you know, so how long do we do this? They asked me. And I've been Indigenous my whole life. When do we stop? Now. We stop that ridiculousness, that oppression now, and we vote. And we vote in the people who will actually represent us. We vote for the people who will have the integrity to stand behind the human rights of Indigenous people. We vote for the people who will ensure that that is intrinsic in our laws and our practice, and that it is not window dressing. We vote for the people who will take our interests and our human rights and our lives into consideration and prioritize that, our water, our land, our conversations. Public service hat back on. Okay, thank you.
I think we're down to the last couple of minutes before we have to vacate this space. And
can we ask you a question?
No. I was trying to deflect this entire time. It just, okay, fine.
I have heard you speak. Now, I've had the honor of hearing you speak as you traveled through the Massey lectures, and how you held that space, not for yourself, but for the stories that you were carrying. How do we hold that space for you further?
Miigwech, that's a beautiful question. Thank you. We share the space. We hold the space for others. The space is not mine. The space comes from the past. As we know, as Indigenous people, we think of the past, those who came before us. We think of those who come after us. We think in circles. We think that everybody belongs. Everybody has a role to play. Every life is sacred, and we are all part of the continuum. I wanted to bring that message with me when I went to visit, and I hope that I bring that message every time that I write and that every time that I speak, that we all matter and we all can change things. And it sounds simple, but it is, and it's not, but we can do it if we work together, if we be the change. And I'm always, you said this earlier, I'm always thankful for our youth because they're the ones that are actually showing the way forward. We're getting older now, and that baton, that mystery baton that we were talking about that somehow landed in our laps, is going again to someone else. And the generation that's coming up, they have so much, and they have their own burdens. They carry with them the traumas our families have been with, but I hope we're getting to a spot where they're working through it and they're getting over it. They're going to use the strength of resiliency and hope that we have in our communities to be part of the continuum and to keep going.